So it's been a great pleasure to have had the chance to reflect on some of the themes of the conference. As I was saying to some people before we got started, and as I'll come back to at the end, we're building a new library at the University of Galway, and we're very much in full spreadsheet mode. So it's nice to have a chance to talk about and think about other dimensions of library and library work. As we will explore together over the next 30 minutes or so, the intersections of inspiration, affordance, and the potential of unexpected but gratefully received prompts as the stacks and the studio interweave have been very much on my mind. Those reflections took me, in the first instance, to the lines you're about to see, which I read when I was in college in Galway in the last century. Always a terrifying realization, and which I have found myself returning to over and over again through the decades. Again, terrifying. We're made so that we love, first when we see them painted, things we have passed perhaps 100 times nor cared to see. And so they are better painted, better to us, which is the same thing. They come from the Victorian poet Robert Browning, who was ultimately exceptionally well known and indeed revered in his own time, though much less so in ours. You may perhaps know him through his romantically celebrated relationship with another poet, whose husband he became, Barrett Browning. And in fact, for the first part of their careers, he was very much known as the husband of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, as she was initially the much more famous of the two. Even if you don't know her name, you may well be familiar with the famous lines from her Sonnet 43 addressed to him. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. And in this portrait of Robert, now housed in the National Portrait Gallery in London, he certainly does have something of the look of a man who is pleasantly assured of his numerous charms. The admirer who commissioned it, Mrs. Eckley, wrote that Browning described it as an incomparable portrait, by far the best ever taken. And I'm sadly still waiting for my own equivalent of that. The lines I have quoted on the previous slide were written by Browning, but it would be misleading to characterize them as something Browning said. So what do I mean by that? It's particularly seductive in poetry to take the voice of the poem as the voice of the poet. And however we might conceptualize that overlay in general, it would certainly be inappropriate in this case. While Browning wrote in many different poetic forms, he was particularly well known for his dramatic monologues. So long pieces of verse in the first person, recreating the world of a variety of figures through a kind of ventriloquism of what they might have said had we had the opportunity to hear them. And for today, one of his particular areas of interest was art and artists. And there are a number of these monologues who give an imagined voice to painters, such as the real Florentine Andrea del Sarto and the fictional Pictor Ignotus, unknown painter in Latin. As a not quite side note, given that it touches on questions of inspiration and refraction, and given the audience, I might recommend another of Browning's work, the chilling My Last Duchess. In this monologue, Browning imagines the voice of Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, whose wife Lucrezia de Medici met with an untimely and possibly suspicious end. In the poem, he is showing a portrait of her, excuse me, and commenting, "Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her. But who passed without much the same smile? This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. There she stands as if alive." And to shake off that chill, I would urge you to turn to the lushly compelling and surprising novel itself, considerably concerned with questions of art and artistic representation, The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell, which responds to the painting and the poem. So via those examples of response and inspiration, let me return to the earlier lines. These are ostensibly spoken by the Renaissance painter Fra Lippo Lippi, and to me, they have always served as an always uplifting reminder of one of the ways in which art can sustain and enrich us, the ways in which we see again or see for the first time those things that have come to seem everyday or pedestrian to us, or which we have simply not been able to see at all until someone else bends their attention to them. More expansively, they suggest to me that we make discoveries in the artistic encounter with different personalities, sensibilities, and experiences. And so, over the next few minutes, I would like to explore with you just some of the libraries and library collections from my own experience that have inspired artistic creation or been in turn inspired by it in a variety of different modes and different moods. As you have probably somehow vaguely managed to intuit by now, even if Andrea had not mentioned it, my own background is literature and books, and I tend to bring that lens to projects. So there will certainly be a literary flavour to this next few minutes library journey. I hope this is a feature rather than a bug, offering a framework for thinking about how your own specialist areas of interest can inform the relationship between the stacks and the studio. I have been extremely fortunate to work at some of Ireland's great libraries, including the National Library, UCD Library, and now the University of Galway, having come home to the west of Ireland last September as Deputy University Librarian. Me in place, and the place in me, as one of Seamus Heaney's poems puts it. And perhaps unexpectedly, Seamus Heaney was the inspiration for this street art on a wall in Dublin. And this street art represents a milestone for a key National Library of Ireland project, which is the first one I'd like to talk to you about. It goes back a very long way for me personally to a piece of graffiti that was visible all over Dublin in 2008, 2009, an example of which I used to see every day on my commute to work in the National Library. It was a piece of typography that said simply, "Macer loves you." And it made me smile and walk with a little more bounce every time I saw it. My sister has a 2-year-old, and she has trained him to say, "You're basic," as an adorable little burn. And I may be overly sensitive, but it seems that he uses it with particular relish with me. And it is true that I am susceptible to a clear and simple message. Macer loves me. Yeah, why wouldn't he? And it meant that I kept that artist in my mind, so that I noticed when he did a mural at the Sugar Club on Dublin's Leeson Street, commemorating the Dublin lockout in 2013, incorporating a historic image that could be found in the National Library's collections. At the time, we were curating an exhibition at the National Library about the Dublin lockout, which was a workers' strike that spread through the city in 1913. And we invited Macer, that artist, to record an audio piece for us about why he chose the historic image. Audio, because at the time he was still largely incognito. Fast forward to 2017, when I was leading on a National Library exhibition about Seamus Heaney, which was being hosted at the magnificent Georgian Bank of Ireland building in Dublin on Westmoreland Street, showcasing the writer's archive that Seamus and his family had donated to the National Library in 2011. At a meeting one day, the curator, Professor Geraldine Higgins, produced this photograph and said she would love to feature it. And happily, we were in a position to go one better, drawing on the relationship already built up from a phrase painted on a wall and a glimpse of a black and white photograph. It was also, I think, as close as I am ever going to get to a proper Blue Peter moment of, here's one I made earlier. I'm not sure I will ever again be able to produce the exact artist someone wants to work with on their literary exhibition, but it certainly was satisfying. sentiment, don't be afraid, itself comes from the last message that Seamus sent his wife Mary just before he went in for routine surgery and very sadly did not come out in August of 2013. Noli timere, it said. Don't be afraid. Macer, Al Hester, his given name, read about it and he was inspired to pay homage to it with the wall piece, described by him as for good people in hard times. Al to come and meet us and talk about what we might do together. It was a perfect example of the intersections of inspiration and prompt from a library's collection and work that I have been talking about. What was particularly striking to me was this sense in which he immediately imagined ways that we could work with his work that would not have been available to us. He immediately ran with the creative possibilities of the idea, and he decided that at the culmination point of the exhibition, it would be great to feature this wall, gesturing towards a cityscape, as you can just about see in the cutouts at the top of the image. Don't be afraid was picked out in sculptural light. And it was his idea to make it chalkboard, so that this piece, placed as it is at the end of the exhibition, would be somewhere that every visitor could make their mark, and which, in a dance between the intrinsic ephemerality of street art, in creative tension with the permanence of archives and libraries, is wiped clean every day for another set of visitors to recreate. It also plays, I think, very elegantly with the desire we often have to interact with library collections in a display setting. Very often you want to pick up the manuscript or hold the book or leaf through it. And it goes some way, I think, to addressing that sense of our need and our desire to engage. The gesture itself here is the art. I particularly like this image of young women at work on the wall, partly because you can see it was one of those days where everybody wanted to write on it, but also because they're so dynamic. You know, they're so actively engaged kinetically with the work of making their mark. And also, because it's three young women, it reminds me of one of my own favourite things that I ever saw on that wall. Seamus Heaney had three granddaughters, and he wrote each of them a poem. Fair, I suppose, if you have a Nobel laureate for a grandfather, you expect to get a poem. On the day of the exhibition launch, each of the girls made their mark. One was too small to write her poem. She drew a flower. Two of them were old enough to write parts of the poem dedicated to them in chalk on this wall. At the bottom of an extract from the poem, A Kite for Aveen, written by Seamus's granddaughter Aveen, the longing in the breast and planted feet and gazing face and heart of the kite flyer until string breaks and separate, elate, the kite takes off, itself alone, a windfall. There was boldly, confidently chalked, hashtag I'm Aveen. We did not know, of course, when the Seamus Heaney exhibition launched in this week in July 2018, that over the coming years, we were going to have many more than all of the usual reasons to be afraid. The National Library closed in March of 2020 when the first of the COVID lockdowns began. And it would be many months before I saw this owl, who is part of the mosaic floor of the Victorian front hall again. I missed him. Athena's bird, the symbol of bravery and wisdom, every time he opened and closed and opened and closed and closed and opened again. And I felt very acutely the ghosts and absences of everyone who should have been enjoying and experiencing and learning in the National Library during this time. The Irish writer Sean O'Faolain, who was once upon a time a trustee of the National Library, said that what matters in libraries is not so much the books that go into them as the works that come out of them. And so it was when we were coming to what turned out to be the end of the lockdowns in the spring of 2021, we had the idea to invite a writer and a visual artist to create something special to mark that moment, which would respond in whatever way they wished to the collections and spaces of the National Library. We started with the writer, Henry McSharry, and she chose to work with the artist and illustrator, Stephanie Sloan. An important example, I think, of the way in which creative practice can be an endlessly expanding universe of generous connection. Together, they chose to create a piece or a series of pieces called Daybreak in the Land of Statues, drawing on Henry's pre-existing knowledge of the National Library's buildings, which are peopled with creatures of all kind, in the floor, on the columns, in the stained glass, on the door handles. They imagined those creatures as inhabiting the secret spaces of the National Library, but not to keep them closed, but rather to mind them and ensure they were ready when we opened. As Henry said in a piece she wrote at the time, we couldn't quite believe that a building so atmospheric and beautiful could be simply dormant when closed. In truth, it's only closed to humans. It remains alive to itself. This inspired the idea that the owl from the mosaic floor at the entrance could come to life. In our story, the owl becomes a guide, traveling through the building at daybreak. He alerts the ghosts and characters who have roamed the library freely overnight that it's time to return to their places, as the building is about to reopen and welcome visitors and staff. Henry crafted short pieces of beautiful text and Stephanie illustrated them, creating a single art piece for display, but also redrafting it as a little leaflet that was given to each reader and visitor who came in. Masked and socially distant, but still there over the weeks from when we first reopened. It was a way of taking the inspiration and the creativity that had come from this engagement, sharing it with everyone and encouraging them to bring it with them as a physical object back out into a world where we were only starting to lose our fear of physical objects and touch once again. You can see here Stephanie's elegant owl in flight, and she describes how he emerged from their shared creative practice. Henry took the lead on the narrative. As it evolved, I created elements that intrigued me, things I really wanted to work on, and those gradually became a part of the story. The owl, as a guiding figure, became central. The idea of him rising from the mosaic floor and flying through the building opened up the space imaginatively for us. I was then and remain deeply moved by the way that he is at once himself and a transformation of the mosaic owl, an evocation of the power of creative collaboration, and a symbolic representation of the inspiration that awaits in libraries, the creative impulses they engender, and crucially, the ways in which that, once unleashed, as was the case with our work with Macer, grows so much more expansive than the imaginings and expectations of the librarians and archivists who work in them, but which is only possible because of that work. That idea that through the interface with others, something emerges that neither could have imagined alone was brought home to me very forcefully through another major exhibition project I was lucky enough to work on at the National Library of Ireland, a partnership between the National Library and University College Dublin to create Molly, the new Museum of Literature Ireland, a playful tribute in the name to Molly Bloom from James Joyce's Ulysses. It's located in Newman House, the first home of UCD in Dublin city centre, and it features many literary treasures from the National Library, as well as a wonderful private collection of Joycean art books loaned by a collector called Desmond Green. If you have not been, I urge you to visit. It makes a very natural partnership with a visit to the gallery. And if you do nothing else, sit in the beautiful garden and smell the roses. What you are looking at here, presented in Molly as the revered object that it is the National Library's copy #1 of Ulysses. Though not the first copy to arrive on publication day on the 2nd of February 1922, a long story for another day, James Joyce wrote Ulysses in multiple cities around Europe through war and wanderings and ill health and frustrations, constantly drafting and redrafting and revising and adding. It's always challenging to convey the relationship between these drafts and the finished work in a compelling and interesting way in an exhibition context. And I was particularly aware of something that the donor who had loaned us his collection of books said to me when Molly was just an idea. When I said to him compulsively, as I was saying to everyone at the time, what should be in it? What should it look like? And he said, oh, I don't think I should be able to imagine it because it should be something that has not yet been imagined. And that's the challenge in many ways, is to work together to imagine something that has not yet been imagined. And this example for me really did part of that work because it takes those drafts created as reproductions, which are full of those crossings out and scribblings and recreations, and imagines them in flight, propulsively heading into the work, the final work within which all of that work is contained. And it does so visually through this installation piece in a way that is so much more to me evocative and telling than the most serious and the most scholarly of interpretation, not least because that scholarly interpretation sometimes drains that sense of creative energy from the process because what you are presented with seems to be so final and so finished. The other element of Molly, of the museum, that I perhaps had not fully imagined and which I have found particularly pleasing was the degree to which it has become a home for new book launches and celebrations. Of particular relevance to our journey and discussion today is that in 2023, it hosted the launch of Grief's Broken Brow, a fine press book featuring poetry and art inspired by archival material and artifacts from the War of Independence or the Civil War. This beautiful book, itself a work of art, was a commission by wonderful colleagues at UCD Library in partnership with Poetry Ireland and Arts Council Northern Ireland. Produced by the Salvage Press as part of Poetry as Commemoration, it brought together the voices of 10 poets and the vision of artist James Earley, renowned for weaving his family's stained glass heritage into contemporary work. And he created a powerful set of images for the book, inspired by the shattered windows of the Public Records Office, which was destroyed during the Civil War in 1922. They created an extremely beautiful book, a work of art born from library and archival collections and manifested through the handprinting by Jamie Murphy and Ellen Martin Friel at the Salvage Press, and none of them were ever on sale. Instead, limited edition copies were presented to libraries around the country where they would be available to everybody. One copy now lives in the heritage collections of the University of Galway Library, where I am now lucky enough to be based also. The wanderings have brought me home to a wonderful library. Sadly, not quite as racy as this photograph from our collections might have you imagine. I could tell you that I chose this particular image from our theatre collections for a whole variety of extremely cerebral reasons, but really it was because I wanted to talk about the collections in Galway using a particular frame. And the part of me that my 2-year-old nephew sees all too clearly couldn't resist the absurdly literal image of a frame in the photograph. This closing element is the way in which we paint a picture for others who might not otherwise see in part of the work of libraries in surfacing the unexpected in their collections. In particular, from my own experience, the visual art and art practice contained in what are otherwise thought of as primarily text-based collections. In that context, I would like to give a little shout out here to Dr. Katie Milligan, who is in the audience today. A wonderful art historian. Katie really shone a light on this dimension for all of us at UCD Library. We used to work together at UCD Library when she worked there. And I am very grateful for her characteristically gentle yet expert teaching. It speaks again, I think, to the way in which we are inspired and enriched by the experience of others and how we carry that into our different roles in different libraries and archives. I have chosen just a couple of examples from Galway of this design and visual art element, which may not be all that apparent from the outside. And I've chosen a couple of images that have struck me because I'm coming to Galway, of course, with the beginner's mind that yoga tells us to cultivate. Because we have such rich archives for theatre and arts practice, there is so much to be discovered, including this and many other posters for the Galway Arts Festival. When I was a girl growing up in Galway, the posters for the Arts Festival were probably the most visible manifestation of distinctive visual art available to everybody every year. And these particular sets of posters created by the artist Joe Buska were a feature of the Galway landscape for all of certainly my young adulthood and teens. We have the Galway Arts Festival archive in the University of Galway, and these posters and many others form part of it. There are also so many designs for stage sets, costumes, portraits of actors, and much more. Another piece that struck me as particularly enjoyable as an experience to see recently were these covers, the covers of Threshold, a literary magazine produced in Belfast from the 1950s onwards. Threshold was one of Northern Ireland's longest running literary periodicals of the 20th century. It was donated to us by the O'Malley family, and it's been digitised and made available online from the University of Galway Library Archives. It was launched just in April as part of the Court Festival. First published in 1957 by its founding editor, Mary O'Malley of the Lyric Players Theatre in Belfast, the journal offered an outlet for what you might expect, leading and emerging writers across poetry and fiction, as well as topical essays, reviews, and criticism for over 30 years. Its final issue was published in 1990, an extraordinary achievement for the complicated and difficult task of publication that is these little magazines. But the key point that I wanted to flag here, that might not otherwise be apparent, is that each of the covers of Threshold had a commissioned image from an artist. And these two images come from female artists working in Northern Ireland. And it showcases their work in a way that the digitization and the making available suddenly brings into focus. One of them, Deborah Brown, was best known as a sculptor, and she had done some stage sets for Mary O'Malley at the Lyric Theatre, and through that collaboration, they came to create the cover which you see on the left here. It was as we were having the launch event with Court that I thought, everybody here is here to talk about the literary side, the theatre side, and yet we are also being presented with this dimension of art and art history that has enriched the experience of everybody who was there. This next image was taken on Bloomsday this year the 16th of June. Since I joined the university in September, I've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to start a staff book club for everybody in the university. As anyone who's in a book club knows, sometimes reading the book is just a step too far in a given month. So I'm very keen that we have opportunities that are for book club members that are connected with dimensions of books that they may not otherwise be familiar with, and which bring them in to our heritage collections. And so, for Bloomsday, the day on which James Joyce's Ulysses is set in 1904, we organised a display of some of the most beautiful Joycean artistic editions, many of which came from the collection of Ronnie O'Gorman. They include a first edition of Ulysses. They include the beautiful limited editions Club Ulysses, which was illustrated by Henri Matisse. Matisse illustrated not Joyce's novel, but rather episodes from the Odyssey on which it is based. And when someone asked him why he had made this interesting artistic choice to illustrate the Odyssey rather than the episodes of Ulysses, he said simply, "Je ne l'ai pas lu." I didn't read it. I'm not sure that that is available to all of us as an excuse, but I'm saving it up perhaps for a big moment in work. Je n'ai pas lu. One of the things that I particularly enjoyed about this day is that the gentleman peering over the case is looking at a particularly special limited edition of Joyce's poems penny each. Simple lyric poems, actually, for anyone who has ever thought they might like to engage with Joyce, but also felt that perhaps their energy was low. The poetry are very simple and elegant lyric pieces. He's looking at this edition, which was handwritten by Joyce, illustrated with his daughter Lucia Joyce's lettrines, so elaborately crafted initial letters, a real art piece, which Joyce had arranged to have sent himself. We have the letter that accompanied it to the University of Galway, because he said it had been written by one of the granddaughters of the tribes. So Joyce's wife, Nora Barnacle, was a Galway woman, and this piece of art found its way back. This gentleman, not a member of staff, nothing to do with the University of Galway, arrived at 1:55 on Bloomsday, clutching a book that gave an account of Joyce's connections with Galway. He had been in Ireland on holiday with his wife. His wife had had a fall and was in the hospital for a few days. They were supposed to be in Dublin for Bloomsday, and he came in with this book and said, "I am looking for this really special edition of Poems Penny Each that James Joyce sent to the University of Galway Library. Is there any possibility that I will be able to see it?" And he was astonished and overjoyed that it was as if we had produced it specially for him to have on the table in our reading room. And finally, I am contractually obliged to tell you that we are building a new library at the University of Galway. I am overjoyed that, having been saying we are about to build, we are going to build, we will be building a new library at the University of Galway. The sod was turned on the building 4 weeks ago, and we are hoping to be open in 2027. This will be an innovative space of discovery, of study, and it offers us a huge opportunity in terms of all of that new space for the kinds of both structured and serendipitous creative engagement and inspiration that I've been lucky enough to encounter in my career. As I said, it's due to open in 2027. It has exhibition and event spaces and all kinds of display and installation opportunities. In many ways, the cross-section that you see at the moment is the perfect thing. Everything is possible at the moment, but I am magpie-like, alert at all times for suggestions and ideas, and if there are any thoughts that you have from your own experiences about how we might surface those intersections of art, of creative practice, and of the library in this new space, I'd be so pleased to hear them. And that brings us back to where we started. with Browning. In bold, you see some further lines from the poem. Art was given for that. God uses us to help each other so, lending our minds out. Was art made for just that? Is God involved? I would remind you that these are Browning's versions of Fra Lippo Lippi's words, and perhaps they are no more or less true than the end of art is peace, or beauty is truth, truth beauty. But if we take God away from it, do I believe that we help each other by lending our minds out to discover, rediscover, and illuminate through the intersections of libraries and art and artists? I certainly do. Thank you for letting me lend my mind out to you for this morning. And I will conclude with the words of the only decent Oscar winner's speech ever by Joe Pesci. It was my privilege. Thank you.
What a great start to the morning. I mean, that was so. I know, I'm shaking. It was emotional for me. It was really inspirational. Thank you so much. And, so there were so many things actually for me personally that you touched on there. But it was just great to see your building actually in Galway. I mean, I'm sure there's many of us that are super jealous of that. But Q&A time. I'm sure there's loads of questions. Does anybody want to ask Katherine something while we have her here? Well, I have a question.
Okay.
If what I just sort of looking at your experience, and I was saying this to you earlier, coming from the National Library, from the National Cultural Institution, and moving into the university libraries. I often wonder, being in a cultural institution myself, is there more scope for those two different types of libraries and colleges, I suppose, to work more closely together? And what do you think we can learn? What are the pros and cons of each area? What can we learn from each other?
So I think within probably all of our institutions, no matter what size, and in the spaces between institutions, the most common thing that I have heard people say everywhere is we all work in silos, and we'd like to work much more closely with our colleagues, and we'd like to work much more closely with them colleagues in other places. And I think that that's both completely true, and one of the interesting things I have found actually is there's not a call for everybody to move around, but moving around is certainly part of that story, and getting the opportunity to learn from your particular colleagues and their sets of experiences. So sorry, Katie, I'm focusing on you again, but there was something really powerful in Katie's art history background, coming into a university library and focusing on the visual arts that were contained within the collections, but then that's something that I've taken with me to another job. And then at the more structural level, I think this kind of conference and these kind of days, and we were talking about this earlier, it can seem like a huge amount of time to take out of what are always very busy lives. But to come to them, and sometimes to go to ones that are maybe at a bit of a slant from your own practice, I think that can really generate interactions. Oh my God, someone does not want us to collaborate. Yeah, exactly. We probably should we? Yes, I'm sorry, I don't think we should be collaborating. I take it all back. But sometimes I think some of the most powerful foundational starting points. Come from individual contact, and then it builds up into something more. I'm sure you've probably had that experience yourself. It starts with some kind of soft contact and turns into projects and something at a higher level.